The air was a heavy, toxic soup that clung to the lungs and burned the throat with every shallow breath. Cale Drennan crouched in the shadows of a rusted girder, the metallic tang of ozone from his cloaking device still faintly detectable. Above him, the sky was a sickly hue of red, fractured by veins of crackling blue energy that rippled through the planet's dense atmosphere. The horizon was littered with skeletal remains of once massive machinery, their silhouettes jagged against the perpetual twilight. This was Senarok, a dead world with a pulse, its very existence a testament to the greed and cruelty of sentient life. Once a thriving industrial hub, it was now little more than a prison for those deemed unworthy of freedom. Kyle adjusted the visor of his tactical mask, his breathing steady, measured, despite the growing unease coiling in his gut. His orders were clear: infiltrate the slave camp, extract intelligence on its operations, and leave without a trace. A simple directive, efficient in its brutality. But simplicity was a luxury on Senarok. Ahead, the labor camp loomed, a sprawling fortress of corroded steel and barbed wire. Floodlights swept the perimeter, their beams slicing through the perpetual gloom. Beyond them, figures toiled under the watchful gaze of towering mechs, their movements slow and mechanical, like clockwork puppets. The camp was alive with the hum of machinery and the occasional crack of an overseer's whip. Cale's fingers brushed the hilt of his plasma blade, a habitual gesture of readiness. Yet something held him back, an instinct sharpened by years of covert missions in hostile territories. He wasn't alone. The realization was subtle at first, a faint prickling at the nape of his neck, a sense of being observed. His visor scanned the area, its display flickering with lines of data. No movement registered, just the endless dance of shadows and light. And then he saw her. She was there, among the prisoners, though she stood out like a flame in the dark. Her form was delicate yet unbroken, her silver hair matted but still luminous under the camp's harsh lights. What struck Cale wasn't her appearance, but her eyes, piercing, unyielding, a stark contrast to the hollow gazes of those around her. She was speaking. No, shouting. Her voice a sharp, defiant cry that sliced through the oppressive noise of the camp. She shielded a younger alien, her slender arms outstretched in a futile gesture of protection. A guard loomed over her, his mechanized frame casting an ominous shadow. Cale's visor picked up fragments of her words, their meaning muddled but unmistakable in intent. She was pleading, not for herself, but for the boy. The guard's response was swift and brutal, a backhanded strike that sent her sprawling into the dirt. Cale's grip on his blade tightened. He knew the cost of intervention, the cascade of consequences that would follow. This was not part of the mission, yet he couldn't look away. "Focus, Drennan," he muttered under his breath, his voice muffled by the mask. His objective lay deeper within the camp. Every second spent here increased the risk of detection, but his feet didn't move. Instead, he found himself studying her more closely. Her species was unfamiliar to him, Zetherian perhaps. Their kind were rare, even in the farthest reaches of known space. Yet there was something more than her alien features, more than the way she carried herself despite her wounds. It was the way the other prisoners looked at her, with a mixture of awe and fear, as if she were something more than just another captive. "Who are you?" Cale whispered to himself. The guard raised his weapon, a jagged baton that crackled with energy. The boy cowered behind her, clutching at her tattered garments. "Stand down," the guard growled, his voice modulated and devoid of emotion. She didn't move. Her gaze locked onto his, unflinching. Cale's heart pounded in his chest, a rhythm out of sync with his training. He had seen bravery before, but this was different. This was madness. The baton crackled to life, its arc illuminating the guard's cruel smirk. Time seemed to slow as Kyle's mind raced. He knew what he was about to do, even before his body acted. The plasma blade ignited with a low hum, its blue glow cutting through the darkness. Cale moved like a shadow, swift and silent, his training taking over. The guard didn't have time to react. One precise strike, and the hulking figure crumpled to the ground. The woman stared up at him, her expression a volatile mix of confusion and defiance. She didn't thank him, didn't cower or run. Instead, she stood, her movements slow and deliberate, and stepped between him and the boy. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the tremor of exhaustion. Kyle didn't answer. He couldn't. His words felt trapped, tangled in the weight of the moment. Alarms began to blare, their shrill cries cutting through the night. The camp erupted into chaos, searchlights converging on their position. Kale extended a hand. "Come with me if you want to live." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing as if trying to read his soul. Then, with a sharp nod, she grabbed the boy's hand and followed. As they slipped into the shadows, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line he could never return from. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he cared. The labyrinthine corridors of the labor camp stretched endlessly, a maze of rusted steel and shadows that whispered secrets of decades-old misery. The alarms continued to wail, their piercing cry echoing off the walls as Kale led the Zitherian woman and the boy through a narrow passage. Every turn, every step, felt like an eternity, the oppressive weight of imminent capture pressing on them like a physical force. Kale's mind was a battlefield of conflicting priorities. He had memorized the camp's layout during his briefing, but those blueprints didn't account for the human or alien factor. His extraction route had been carefully planned to ensure stealth, but now it was compromised, tangled in the threads of his impulsive decision to intervene. The woman, Amira, as she had hastily introduced herself, followed with a silent intensity that unnerved him. She moved with an uncanny precision, her steps light despite her apparent exhaustion. The boy, however, stumbled frequently, his small frame trembling as he clung to her hand. Kyle risked a glance back. "He won't make it much farther at this pace," he muttered, his voice low enough not to carry but sharp enough to make his point. Amira's piercing eyes met his, unyielding. "Then we carry him," she said, her voice cold but steady. "We don't have time. We don't have a choice," she snapped, cutting him off. Her tone was one of quiet authority, not desperation, and it struck Kale harder than he expected. Before he could argue further, the distant hum of mechanized footsteps reached them, growing louder with every passing second. The patrolling mechs were closing in, their relentless pursuit guided by the camp's automated systems. Kyle cursed under his breath and scanned their surroundings. A ventilation shaft loomed ahead, its grated entrance barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't on the map, and that meant it might offer a way out, or at least a temporary reprieve. "This way," he hissed, motioning for them to follow. He knelt by the grate, prying it open with the hilt of his plasma blade. The metal groaned in protest, the sound far too loud for comfort. Amira helped the boy into the shaft first, her movements careful but swift. When she climbed in after him, Kale caught a glimpse of the raw determination etched into her features, a look that made him question how someone so outwardly fragile could seem so indomitable. The shaft was narrow and claustrophobic, its walls slick with condensation and grime. They moved in single file, Kale leading the way. The alarms faded into a dull hum, replaced by the muffled sounds of the camp's machinery, a symphony of grinding gears and distant clanks that seemed to echo from every direction. Amira's voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come back for us." Kale didn't turn around. "I didn't plan to." "Then why did you?" The question hung in the air like smoke, suffocating in its simplicity. Kale hesitated, unsure if he even had an answer. The truth was buried somewhere beneath layers of instinct and impulse, too raw to face directly. "Didn't seem right leaving you there," he said finally, his tone brusque. "That's all." Her laugh was soft and bitter. "And now you've made yourself a target. A noble death, but a foolish one." Kyle clenched his jaw. "Not planning on dying today." "You think this is survivable?" she pressed, her voice a razor edge of skepticism. Kyle didn't reply. The shaft opened into a maintenance chamber, its walls lined with decaying consoles and dormant machinery. Kale climbed out first, his plasma blade drawn and ready. The chamber appeared empty, but he knew better than to trust appearances. Amira followed, lifting the boy out with a care that belied her sharp words. The boy clung to her, his wide, terrified eyes darting around the room. "What's his name?" Kyle asked, gesturing toward the child. "Relek," Amira said, brushing a strand of silver hair from the boy's face. Her voice softened slightly as she added, "He's not mine, if that's what you're wondering." "His parents." She stopped, her jaw tightening. "He was alone when I found him." Kyle nodded, deciding not to press further. He had seen too many stories like theirs to expect anything but pain beneath the surface. A sudden burst of static from a nearby console made them all jump. Kyle approached it cautiously, his visor scanning for signs of activity. The screen flickered to life, displaying a grainy image of the camp's overseer, a hulking figure clad in black armor. "Attention, all personnel," the overseer's voice boomed, distorted but unmistakably human. "The intruder has compromised Camp Vortex. Engage Protocol Omega. Do not let them escape." Kyle's blood ran cold. Protocol Omega wasn't in the briefing. It was a wild card, and wild cards got people killed. Amira stepped beside him, her expression unreadable. "You didn't answer my question earlier," she said quietly. Kyle frowned. "What question?" "Why a human would risk his life for someone like me." Her words carried a weight he couldn't ignore, a weight that hinted at something deeper, a history perhaps, or a wound she wasn't ready to reveal. "Maybe I'm not like the others," he said, meeting her gaze. Her lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "We'll see." Before he could respond, the distant thrum of approaching mechs shattered the fragile moment. "We need to move," Kale said, his voice sharp with urgency. Amira nodded, her earlier skepticism replaced by a grim resolve. Together, they hoisted Relek and disappeared into the darkened tunnels beyond, the echoes of their footsteps swallowed by the abyss. And as they ran, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that the mysteries surrounding Amira and his own actions were only beginning to unfold. The tunnel opened into a cavernous expanse, a hollowed-out section of the planet that seemed forgotten by time. Massive stalactites hung from the ceiling like jagged teeth, their tips glistening with condensation that dripped into shallow pools below. The air was cooler here, less choked with the acrid tang of machinery. Kale Drennan swept his visor across the space, its display casting a faint blue glow. The readings showed no immediate threats, but this place, this strange sanctuary carved into the bowels of Senorok, felt too quiet. "We can rest here for a moment," Kale said, lowering his plasma blade. Amira glanced around, her expression guarded. Relek clung to her side, his small frame trembling with exhaustion. "How long is a moment?" she asked, her voice tight with mistrust. Kale didn't answer. His focus was on the faint markings etched into the cavern walls. They resembled alien script, though their edges were worn and blurred by time. He ran a gloved hand over them, his mind churning with questions. "What is this place?" Amira asked, stepping closer. "Old Zytherian," Kale murmured, his visor translating the fragments. The words were cryptic, references to buried power and eternal vigilance. He turned to Amira, the weight of realization settling over him. "Your people built this." Amira's sharp intake of breath confirmed it. She studied the markings, her fingers trailing over the grooves. "It's a resistance symbol," she said softly, her voice tinged with both awe and sorrow. "This was a sanctuary during the war centuries ago." "Does it still work?" Kale asked, motioning to a dormant control panel embedded in the wall. She shook her head. "If it did, my people would have come here long ago. Places like this, they're forgotten." Kale's response was cut short by the faint hum of approaching danger. He turned sharply, his visor picking up heat signatures on the far side of the cavern. The search mechs had found them. "Move!" he barked, grabbing Relic and motioning for Amira to follow. They scrambled deeper into the cavern, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The mech's glowing optics pierced the darkness, their mechanical limbs clicking ominously as they gave chase. Kyle led them down a narrow passage, the walls closing in around them. His visor struggled to map the twisting route, the signal faltering as they descended further into the planet's depths. Finally, the passage opened into another chamber, smaller, but just as ancient. In the center stood an obelisk, its surface covered in pulsing, faintly glowing runes. The sight stopped Amira in her tracks, her breath catching. "This isn't possible," she whispered. Kyle turned to her, his expression grim. "What is it?" "It's a life nexus," she said, stepping forward as if in a trance. "A relic from the old war. They were thought to be destroyed, every last one." "What does it do?" Kyle pressed, his voice edged with urgency. Amira knelt before the obelisk, her fingers brushing its surface. "It's a weapon," she said, her tone both reverent and fearful. "But not in the way you think. It doesn't destroy. It restores. It channels the life force of its surroundings, healing what was broken, rebuilding what was lost." Kale's stomach tightened. A weapon like that could tip the balance of power in the galaxy. No wonder the Zetherians had been hunted to near extinction. The sound of the mech's pursuit drew closer, their relentless march echoing through the tunnels. Kale glanced at Amira. "Can you activate it?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and the obelisk. "I don't know. It requires a Zetherian bond, something I've only heard of in stories." Kale didn't have time for hesitation. "Try." Amira placed both hands on the obelisk, her expression taut with concentration. The runes flared brighter, their light spreading across the chamber like ripples in water. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy that made the hair on Kale's arms stand on end. The mechs burst into the chamber, their optics locking onto the trio. Kale raised his plasma blade, ready to make a stand, but before he could strike, the obelisk released a wave of energy. The mechs froze mid-step, their limbs twitching erratically before collapsing in a heap. The light from the obelisk dimmed, and the chamber fell silent once more. Amira swayed, her strength clearly drained. Kyle caught her before she could fall, lowering her gently to the ground. "You did it," he said, his voice a mixture of relief and awe. Amira shook her head weakly. "It wasn't me. The Nexus, it responded on its own." Kyle's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means it wasn't meant for me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her gaze shifted to Relic, who stood nearby, his wide eyes fixed on the obelisk. "It was meant for him." The boy stepped forward hesitantly, as if drawn by an invisible force. His small hand reached out to touch the obelisk, and as he did, the runes flared once more, their light enveloping him in a warm glow. Kale's breath caught. "What is he?" Amira's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "A beacon," she said softly. "A spark of what we thought we'd lost forever." The implications were staggering, and Kale's mind raced with the possibilities. This boy, this fragile, terrified child, was the key to something far greater than any of them had imagined. But with that realization came a chilling certainty. They weren't just running for survival anymore. They were carrying the weight of a dying race's last hope, and the galaxy wouldn't stop hunting them until it was extinguished. Kyle's jaw tightened as he rose to his feet, his resolve hardening. "Then we don't let them take him." Amira nodded, her determination mirroring his. The stakes had shifted, and the path ahead was perilous, but there was no turning back now. For the first time in years, Kale felt a glimmer of purpose. And for the first time, he truly understood what was at stake. The silence that followed the obelisk's awakening was as heavy as the air in the cavern. Relic stood bathed in its pale glow, his small frame seemingly dwarfed by the ancient relic's power. The child's wide eyes were transfixed, reflecting the runes that pulsed in rhythmic patterns, as if speaking a language only he could hear. Kyle felt the tension in his chest tighten. "We can't stay here," he said, breaking the spell of stillness. His voice echoed faintly off the stone walls, and he turned his attention back to the tunnel. He could still feel the hum of the mech's presence deeper in the labyrinth, even if the obelisk had temporarily disabled them. Amira knelt by Relic, her hands trembling as she reached out. "Relic," she whispered. The boy didn't respond immediately, his gaze still locked on the obelisk. Finally, he blinked and looked up at her. It spoke to me," he said, his voice fragile but filled with wonder. "What did it say?" Kale demanded, stepping closer. Relic hesitated, his small hands clenching at his sides. "It said I'm a key," he murmured, "that I can open something called the heart." "The heart," Amira repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "It's not possible. It was a legend, even among my people." "What is it?" Kyle asked, his tone sharper than intended. Amira rose slowly, her gaze fixed on the obelisk. "If the stories are true, the heart is the nexus of Zitherian life energy. It was said to hold the collective essence of our ancestors, a power capable of reshaping entire worlds." Kale frowned, his thoughts racing. "And if that power fell into the wrong hands?" Amira's expression darkened. "It would mean devastation on a scale you can't imagine." Kale's stomach twisted. He didn't need her to spell it out. He could already see the implications. A galaxy fractured by war, with factions willing to burn planets to claim such a prize. The faint hum of the obelisk began to wane, its glow dimming as the energy around it receded. Kyle turned his attention to Relic, who was now looking at him with a mixture of fear and trust that made Kale's chest ache. "We need to move," Kale said firmly. "Whatever that thing told him, you can explain it later. Right now, we're sitting ducks." Amira nodded reluctantly, taking Relic's hand as they turned toward the far end of the chamber. Kyle led the way, his visor scanning for potential threats. A crossroads of betrayal. They had barely made it halfway down the next tunnel when Kale's visor detected motion. He signaled for the others to stop, his plasma blade igniting with a sharp hum. From the shadows ahead stepped a figure cloaked in black, their presence commanding and cold. The camp's overseer. Kale tensed, his weapon raised. "How the hell did you find us?" The overseer's helmet tilted slightly, as if amused. "You underestimate the reach of those you've crossed, soldier." His voice was distorted, mechanical, but Kale caught the faintest trace of smugness beneath it. Amira stepped forward, placing herself between Relic and the overseer. "You won't take him," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The overseer chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down Kale's spine. "You misunderstand, Zitherian. I don't need to take him. I only need to ensure that he fulfills his purpose." Kale's grip tightened on his blade. "And what purpose is that?" The overseer raised a gauntleted hand, and from behind him emerged two more figures, human soldiers. Kale recognized their insignias immediately. The Nova Syndicate, a mercenary force notorious for doing the galaxy's dirtiest jobs. One of them spoke, his voice gruff. "Step aside, Drennan. You've done your part." Kale's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. Commander Farron, his former superior, the man who had ordered the mission to infiltrate Senarok in the first place. Kale's jaw clenched. "This wasn't part of the mission briefing." Farron smirked. "The briefing didn't cover everything. You've always been a little too naive for this line of work, Kale." "You sent me here to retrieve them," Kale said, his voice rising with anger. "Not to hand them over to a damn mercenary syndicate." Farron shrugged. "Orders change. The boy's power is too valuable to leave in the hands of idealists." Kale stepped forward, his blade held high. "I don't take orders from people who sell children to the highest bidder." The tension in the air was palpable, a fragile thread ready to snap. The overseer raised his hand again, this time activating a device on his wrist. The obelisk in the distant chamber flared to life once more, its energy pulsing through the tunnels. "Do you feel that?" the overseer asked, his voice almost reverent. "That's the heartbeat of a dying legacy. and soon it will belong to us. Kyle's mind raced. If the Syndicate gained control of the obelisk, and by extension Relic, they could unleash chaos across the galaxy. "Kale," Amira said softly, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "You have to make a choice." He turned to her, his heart sinking at the look in her eyes. She wasn't pleading for her life or even Relic's. She was asking him to choose between his duty and his conscience. "Get the boy out of here," Kale said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "What are you— Go!" he snapped, cutting her off. "I'll hold them off." Amira hesitated for a split second before nodding. She took Relic's hand and began to run, disappearing into the shadows of the tunnel. Kyle turned back to the Overseer and Farron, his plasma blade glowing fiercely. "If you want them, you'll have to go through me." Farron sighed. "You always were too stubborn for your own good." The battle erupted in a flash of light and sound, Kale's blade clashing against the Syndicate's weapons. He fought with a desperation born of purpose, every move calculated to buy Amira and Relic more time. But as the Overseer's forces closed in, Kale knew the cost of his choice. He might not survive this fight, but if it meant giving the boy a chance to escape, it was a price he was willing to pay. Kale staggered backward, the weight of exhaustion pressing on him like a collapsing star. His plasma blade sparked and flickered, its once brilliant hum reduced to an erratic, faltering sound. Around him, the tunnel was littered with the remnants of the Syndicate's assault, the charred husks of mechs, broken weaponry, and the heavy stillness of silence. But it wasn't over. The Overseer stood at the edge of the dim light, his silhouette sharp and unyielding. His mask glinted, and his voice cut through the air like steel. "You fought valiantly, Drennan, but heroism is a fleeting virtue. You're just a man standing in the way of inevitability." Kale tightened his grip on his blade, though his arms ached with every movement. "Maybe," he said, his voice ragged. "But if inevitability is people like you, I'll stand here until the stars burn out." The Overseer's mechanical laugh echoed. Bold words for a man on the verge of collapse. Kyle took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "Bold enough to keep you from them. That's all I need to be." Before the Overseer could respond, the tunnel trembled, a low rumble building from the depths. Kale felt it beneath his boots, a resonance that grew louder, stronger, until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate with life. And then it came. A wave of golden light surged through the tunnel, its brilliance forcing Kale to shield his eyes. It was the energy of the obelisk, but magnified 100-fold, as if the Nexus had awakened fully. The light passed over him, warm and electric, and when he opened his eyes, the Overseer and his remaining forces were frozen in place, their bodies locked in a stasis-like shimmer. Kyle turned to see Amira and Relic standing at the far end of the passage. The boy was bathed in the same light, his small hands raised, his expression serene yet resolute. The energy radiated from him like a supernova, pouring through the tunnels and beyond. "Relic," Kyle breathed, his voice a mix of awe and fear. Amira stepped forward, her eyes glistening. "He's completing the bond," she said softly. "He's becoming the heart." Kyle's chest tightened. "What does that mean?" Amira hesitated, her voice trembling. "It means he's giving himself to the Nexus. It will restore the balance, heal what's been broken. But at a cost." Kyle's heart sank. He looked at Relic, the boy who had clung to him in fear, who had trusted him despite everything. "There has to be another way," he said, his voice desperate. Relic turned to him then, his eyes glowing with a light that was not entirely his own. "This is my way," he said, his voice calm but filled with an ancient weight, as though speaking for generations. "You saved me, Kyle. Now I can save them, all of them." Kyle shook his head, his fists clenching. "You're just a kid. You shouldn't have to do this." Relic smiled faintly, a smile that broke Kale's heart. "Sometimes the smallest sparks make the brightest stars." Amira placed a hand on Kale's arm, her touch gentle but firm. "He was born for this, Kale. And because of you, He lived long enough to fulfill it. Cale's throat tightened as he fought back the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had spent his life fighting battles he didn't believe in, following orders that led to destruction. But this was a choice, and it wasn't his to make. Will he be okay? Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amira's gaze softened. He'll be more than okay. He'll be eternal. Kyle nodded, his jaw tightening as he stepped back. He met Relic's glowing gaze one last time. You're the bravest person I've ever met, he said. Relic's smile widened, and then he turned back to the Nexus. The light intensified, filling the cavern until it was blinding. Kyle shielded his eyes, but he could feel it, waves of warmth and renewal washing over him, carrying with them a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. When the light finally receded, the cavern was still. The Overseer and his forces were gone, disintegrated into nothingness. The obelisk stood silent once more, its glow extinguished, and Relic was gone. A new dawn. The days that followed were a blur. Kyle and Amira emerged from the tunnels to find the landscape transformed. The toxic skies of Senarok had cleared, revealing a vibrant, star-filled expanse. The barren ground was covered in patches of green, signs of life slowly returning. Word of the Nexus's awakening spread quickly. Across the galaxy, the ripple effects were felt. Systems once on the brink of collapse stabilized, and ancient wounds began to heal. For the first time in centuries, there was hope. Kale stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the transformed valley, his armor battered, but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. Amira joined him, her expression both somber and hopeful. He's out there, she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. Kyle nodded. Yeah, he is. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling over them. What will you do now? Amira asked finally. Kale took a deep breath, the crisp air filling his lungs. I don't know, he admitted. But for the first time, I think I'll figure it out. Amira smiled faintly, her gaze distant. The galaxy owes him a debt it can never repay. And us? Kyle asked, his tone light but edged with weariness. Amira chuckled softly. We're just the ones who carried the spark. Kale turned to her, a rare smile breaking through his hardened features. That's enough for me. As they stood together, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting the valley in golden light. It was a new beginning, not just for them, but for the galaxy they had fought to protect. And somewhere, in the endless expanse of stars, Kale knew Relic's light burned brighter than ever. The station hummed with life, a sprawling lattice of metal and glass suspended in the quiet void of space. The distant star it orbited cast a golden glow through the transparent panels, painting the corridors in shifting hues of amber and crimson. The air inside, artificial yet crisp, carried the faint hum of the station's life support systems, a sound so constant it became the backdrop to existence, ignored by all who lived there. Marcus Voss, Earth's senior diplomat, stood in his private quarters, staring at his reflection in the full-length mirror. The man who gazed back looked the part of a negotiator, impeccably dressed in tailored attire, his dark hair smoothed into submission, his sharp blue eyes betraying an intellect honed for high-stakes diplomacy. Yet behind that polished exterior, Marcus felt the tension that had been gnawing at him for weeks. The summit loomed closer, a gathering of volatile alien factions who saw peace as an inconvenience rather than a goal. As he adjusted his collar, the lights flickered, once, twice, subtle, almost unnoticeable, yet enough to draw Marcus's gaze to the ceiling. The station's systems were supposed to be flawless. This flicker wasn't the first anomaly he had noticed. The previous night, he had awoken to a strange vibration beneath the floor, a rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat. The engineers dismissed it as a minor malfunction, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. A chime from the console broke his thoughts. "Ambassador Voss," the synthetic voice announced. "You have a message from Administrator Callan." Marcus crossed the room, the soles of his boots silent against the polished floor. The console screen glowed, displaying a single line of text. Urgent. Security briefing in conference room Epsilon. Attend immediately. There was no sender signature, no official seal. Marcus frowned, his fingers hovering over the reply interface. Protocol dictated that messages from the station's administrator were always encrypted. This one wasn't. Before he could respond, the lights flickered again, this time plunging the room into brief darkness. When they returned, Marcus's breath caught. A figure stood at the edge of the room, barely more than a shadow against the backdrop of the golden light. It was motionless, silent. "Who's there?" Marcus demanded, his voice steady despite the sudden chill crawling up his spine. The figure stepped forward, and the dim light caught the curve of a weapon, a sleek alien design that glimmered with lethal promise. Marcus's heart pounded as adrenaline surged. "Security!" he shouted, but the station's soundproofing swallowed his voice. He took a step back, calculating his chances of reaching the emergency alarm. The figure lunged, but before it could strike, another shadow burst into motion, a blur of iridescent light and fluid precision. The intruder staggered, their weapon clattering to the ground, as a second figure moved with inhuman speed, disarming and incapacitating them in moments. Marcus's mind reeled as he tried to make sense of the scene. The second figure turned to him, her features partially illuminated by the amber glow. She was like no one he had ever seen. Her skin shimmered, catching the light in a way that defied natural hues, and her eyes burned gold, glowing faintly, as if holding the light of 1,000 suns. "You're safe now," she said, her voice calm and low, edged with an accent Marcus couldn't place. He stared at her, stunned. "Who are you?" "That's not important," she replied, her gaze flicking to the subdued intruder. She crouched beside the unconscious figure, inspecting them with practiced efficiency. Marcus found his voice again. "It's important to me. You just saved my life." Her lips quirked into the faintest shadow of a smile. "Let's just say your survival aligns with my goals. For now." The cryptic answer only deepened the mystery swirling around her. Before he could press further, the room's door hissed open, and 2 security officers rushed in, weapons drawn. The woman rose smoothly, her movements graceful yet calculated. "Your security is lacking," she said, her tone neutral but her words cutting. "You'll want to question this one." She nodded toward the unconscious intruder. The officers hesitated, their gazes darting between her and Marcus. "Ambassador, are you unharmed?" one of them asked. Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving the woman. "I'm fine, thanks to her. Detain the attacker, and lock down the station until we know how they got in." The officers moved to comply, but the woman stepped past them, her presence commanding attention. "This won't be the last attempt," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried an undeniable weight. "If you want to live, you'll need me." Marcus's instinct was to push back, to demand answers, but something in her tone stopped him. There was no arrogance, no bravado, only certainty. "Why should I trust you?" he asked. "You shouldn't," she said simply, meeting his gaze with her luminous eyes. "But you don't have much of a choice." Before he could respond, she turned and walked out, leaving Marcus standing in the golden light of his quarters, surrounded by unanswered questions and the unsettling realization that his life had just taken a dangerous turn. The tension in the station was palpable, an unspoken current that thrummed through its corridors like an electric charge. Security personnel moved in tight, purposeful formations, their voices clipped as they coordinated the lockdown. Amber emergency lights cast shifting shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. Marcus Voss sat at the edge of the conference table in room Epsilon, his hands resting on the polished surface. The room felt too quiet, too still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Across from him stood the woman who had saved his life, her alien features partially obscured by the dim lighting. Her name she had reluctantly offered was Ciel. No last name, no origin. When pressed, she had deflected with the same quiet confidence that seemed to define her every move. Now, as Marcus studied her, The questions buzzed in his mind like an irritating swarm. Who was she? Why had she intervened? And why did she know more about his enemies than his own intelligence team? "I need answers," Marcus said finally, breaking the silence. His voice carried an edge, though his instinct told him not to antagonize her. "You can't expect me to accept your help without knowing who you are or what you want." Syle's golden eyes met his, unflinching. "What I want," she said, her voice as calm as ever, "is to ensure you don't end up like the others." Marcus's stomach tightened. "The others?" She leaned forward slightly, her movements deliberate. "Your predecessor, the negotiator from Lyra Station, Ambassador Drazen, and 3 others before him, all targeted in similar circumstances." He froze, the air in the room seeming to grow heavier. Drazen's death had been ruled an accident, a shuttle malfunction. "Are you saying those weren't accidents?" "I'm saying someone is methodically eliminating key figures in your alliance," Sale replied. "And if you don't listen to me, you'll be next." The weight of her words settled like a stone in his chest. Marcus had suspected the stakes of the summit were high, but this revelation redefined the danger. "Who's behind it?" he demanded. Sale's gaze flicked toward the security cameras in the room's corners. "Not here," she said quietly. "The walls have ears." Marcus followed her eyes, unease prickling at the back of his neck. The station was supposed to be secure. Every camera, every channel monitored by his team. The thought that someone might be watching, listening, sent a chill down his spine. He stood abruptly. "Follow me." Sale didn't hesitate, her movements fluid as she fell into step behind him. Together, they navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the station, Marcus leading her to a place he trusted implicitly, his personal quarters. Once inside, Marcus activated a jamming device hidden beneath his desk. The soft hum of the device filled the room, masking their conversation from any prying ears. "All right," he said, turning to face her. "Talk." Sile didn't sit, instead pacing the room with the coiled energy of someone accustomed to constant vigilance. "Your alliance threatens powerful interests," she began, "not just on your side, but on mine as well." Marcus frowned. "Yours? You mean your people?" She hesitated, a flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossing her face. "My people are complicated. Some want peace. Others see this summit as an opportunity to destabilize your coalition. I was sent here to observe." "Observe," Marcus repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "And intervene when necessary, I suppose." Her golden eyes locked onto his. "I didn't plan to intervene, but when I saw that assassin in your quarters, I made a choice." "Why?" he pressed. "Why risk exposing yourself?" For the first time, she hesitated. "Because," she said finally, "peace is worth protecting, even if it means bending the rules." Marcus leaned against his desk, his mind racing. If what she said was true, the implications were staggering. Not only was his life in danger, but the entire summit could be a facade for something far darker. A knock at the door shattered the moment. Marcus's heart leapt as he glanced toward the entrance. "Who is it?" "Administrator Callan," came the muffled reply. "Ambassador Voss, we need to speak immediately." Marcus exchanged a glance with Sale, who nodded once, her hand hovering near the concealed blade at her waist. He opened the door, revealing Callan's familiar face, etched with worry. "Marcus," Callan began, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We've apprehended the intruder from your quarters. He's refusing to talk, but there's something else." "What?" Marcus asked, his unease growing. Callan glanced at Sale, his brow furrowing. "Who is this?" "She's with me," Marcus said firmly. "What's the issue?" Callan hesitated, clearly debating whether to press the matter, but the urgency in his expression won out. "The security logs. They've been tampered with. Whoever got into your quarters had inside help." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. an inside job. That meant someone on his own team, a trusted colleague, had betrayed him. "Do we know who?" he asked, his voice tight. Callan shook his head. "Not yet, but if they've compromised security, the entire summit is at risk." Sale stepped forward, her presence commanding despite her silence until now. "Then you'll need to move quickly," she said. "The longer you wait, the more time they have to strike again." Callan's eyes narrowed. "And who exactly are you to give orders here?" Marcus raised a hand, cutting off the brewing argument. "Enough. Callan, focus on finding the mole, and tighten security around the summit. Quietly. I don't want panic." Callan nodded reluctantly and left, the door hissing shut behind him. Marcus turned to Sale. "You were right," he admitted, the words tasting bitter. "There's more going on here than I realized, but if you're going to stay, I need to know I can trust you." Sale tilted her head, a faint, enigmatic smile tugging at her lips. "Trust is earned, Ambassador. Let's see if we both survive long enough for that." Her words hung in the air as Marcus felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Trust her, and she could be the key to unraveling this conspiracy. Doubt her, and she could be leading him into a trap. Either way, the stakes had never been higher, and the clock was ticking. The station hummed with an undercurrent of urgency. The corridors, usually busy but orderly, now felt charged with tension as security personnel doubled their patrols. Shadows seemed darker, every corner a potential threat. Marcus Voss moved through the maze of hallways, his mind racing with the new revelations. The betrayal within his ranks loomed large, its implications chilling. Who had sold him out, and how far did the conspiracy extend? Sale walked silently beside him, her steps light, her posture alert. There was something almost feline about her movements, a predator always poised to strike. Marcus glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, questions swirling. She was an enigma wrapped in contradictions, a savior, an intruder, and potentially a traitor. They reached the heart of the station, the central command hub. As the heavy doors slid open, Marcus braced himself for what awaited inside. Administrator Callan stood at the center of the room, a holographic display illuminating his face in flickering shades of blue and green. Around him, analysts and technicians worked feverishly, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "Marcus," Callan said, his voice grave, "we've identified the breach." Marcus stepped forward, Sale lingering near the door. "What have you found?" Callan gestured toward the holographic display, where a detailed map of the station rotated slowly. The tampering originated in Sublevel 4. The logs were accessed from a secured terminal in the communications sector. Marcus frowned. Sublevel 4 was restricted, its access limited to a select few. "Who had clearance?" "That's where it gets complicated," Callan replied, his expression darkening. "The terminal was accessed using your credentials." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Marcus stared at him, his mind reeling. "That's impossible." "We thought so too," Callan said. "But the logs don't lie. Either someone cloned your credentials or someone close to me used them," Marcus finished, his voice low. The room fell silent, the weight of the accusation heavy. Sale broke the tension, her voice cutting through like a blade. "You have a traitor," she said, stepping closer. "Someone with access to your private systems, someone you trust." Marcus clenched his fists. The thought of betrayal was almost unbearable. His team was more than colleagues. They were people he'd fought alongside, trusted with his life. Before he could respond, an alert blared through the command hub, its shrill tone sending a jolt of adrenaline through the room. Technicians scrambled to their stations as Callan barked orders. "What is it?" Marcus demanded. "A breach in the docking bay," one of the technicians called out. "Unauthorized ship detected." Marcus exchanged a glance with Sale, who nodded once, her expression unreadable. "Seal off the area," Marcus ordered. "Send a team to intercept." As the technicians carried out his commands, Marcus turned to Sale. "You're coming with me." Without waiting for her response, he strode toward the exit, his heart pounding. In the docking bay was a cavernous space, its walls lined with rows of sleek ships. The air was thick with tension as Marcus and Sale entered, flanked by a squad of security officers. The unauthorized vessel stood out immediately, a small unmarked craft with its hatch ominously ajar. "Hold position," Marcus commanded, his voice steady despite the knot of anxiety in his chest. Sale moved ahead of him, her movements precise and deliberate. She approached the craft, her hand resting lightly on the hilt of her concealed blade. "Whoever's in there," she called out, her voice sharp, "step out slowly. We're armed." For a moment, there was silence. Then, with an agonizing slowness, a figure emerged. Marcus's breath caught. The man who stepped out was someone he knew, someone he trusted. "Lieutenant Harrow?" Harrow raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, his face pale but defiant. "Ambassador Voss," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "This isn't what it looks like." Marcus stepped forward, his mind racing. Harrow was one of his closest advisors, a man he'd worked with for years. The idea that he could be involved in the conspiracy was almost unthinkable. "Explain yourself," Marcus demanded. Harrow hesitated, his eyes darting toward the security officers. "Not here," he said quietly. "There are things you don't understand." Sale moved closer, her gaze like a predator sizing up prey. "We're out of time for half-truths," she said coldly. "Speak now, or we'll assume the worst." Harrow's expression hardened. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his voice gaining strength. "This summit, it's a trap. They've been planning it for months, waiting for the right moment to strike." "Who's they?" Marcus pressed. Before Harrow could answer, a sharp crack echoed through the bay. Marcus instinctively ducked as a bolt of energy sizzled past him, striking the wall behind Harrow. "Ambush!" Sale shouted, drawing her blade in one fluid motion. The docking bay erupted into chaos. Figures emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on Marcus and his team. Sale moved like a whirlwind, her blade flashing as she took down the nearest attacker. Marcus scrambled for cover, his heart pounding as bolts of energy lit up the bay. Amid the chaos, Harrow made a break for the unmarked ship. Marcus saw him disappear into the hatch just as the craft's engines roared to life. "Stop him!" Marcus shouted, but it was too late. The ship lifted off, its thrusters scorching the deck as it shot toward the exit. Sile sprinted after it, her movements impossibly fast. She launched herself onto the ship's hull, clinging to its side as it ascended. "Sail!" Marcus called out, but she was already out of reach. The craft disappeared through the bay's force field, leaving Marcus and his team in stunned silence. Back in the command hub, Marcus paced furiously, his thoughts a chaotic storm. Harrow's betrayal was undeniable, but his cryptic warning lingered in Marcus's mind. This summit, it's a trap. What had Harrow meant? And why had Sale pursued him so recklessly? As if on cue, the doors hissed open, and Sale entered. Her clothes were scorched, and a gash on her arm bled freely, but her expression was victorious. In her hand, she held a data drive. "This," she said, holding it out to Marcus, "is everything. Harrow's communications, his plans, his orders. We were right. There's a conspiracy. And now we have proof." Marcus took the drive, his hands shaking. The stakes had just escalated, and the path ahead was more dangerous than ever. But one thing was clear. The enemy was closer than he'd ever imagined. The silence in the command hub was suffocating. Marcus Voss stood frozen, his fingers tightening around the data drive Sale had handed him. The weight of its implications hung heavily in the air. Around him, technicians cast nervous glances, their usual chatter replaced with tense whispers. Sale leaned against a console, her injured arm hastily bandaged, her piercing gaze fixed on Marcus. "Play it," she said, her voice low but insistent. Marcus hesitated, his thumb brushing over the smooth surface of the drive. A part of him wasn't ready for the truth it held, but there was no turning back now. He inserted the drive into the console, and the holographic display flared to life. A cascade of encrypted files appeared, their headers scrolling across the screen like a damning indictment. Names, dates, coordinates. Zale's fingers danced across the console, decrypting the first file with ease. The room darkened as a recording began to play. Harrow's voice filled the space, sharp and frantic. "We've secured the data on Voss, but the summit's timing is critical. The benefactors won't wait. If we miss this window, the operation collapses." Another voice responded, deep and distorted by modulation. "Ensure Voss is neutralized. Without him, the Terran delegation will fall into chaos, and our influence will solidify. Fail, and there will be no redemption." The recording ended abruptly, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. Marcus's blood ran cold. "They were planning to assassinate you," Sale said, her tone matter-of-fact. Marcus took a step back, his mind racing. The summit, meant to unite Terrans and their alien allies, had been infiltrated by a conspiracy that aimed to tear it apart. Callan, who had been standing quietly by the main console, finally spoke. "This changes everything. If Harrow was working with external forces, we need to identify them, and fast." "There's more," Sile said, pulling up a second file. This one was a video feed. It showed Harrow in a dimly lit room, speaking to a shadowy figure whose face remained obscured. "The benefactors demand results," the figure said. "Voss must die, and the station must be destabilized. We have agents embedded across key sectors. Execute the plan, or we'll find someone who can." The screen went black. Marcus exhaled sharply. "The benefactors. Who are they?" Sael crossed her arms, her expression grim. "Not who. What. Benefactors are what we call silent investors in war. Shadow organizations that profit from galactic instability. They fund insurgencies, supply weapons, and manipulate governments to keep the cycle of conflict alive." Marcus's stomach churned. "And now they're here, on the station, targeting the summit." Sile nodded. "And they've already positioned themselves to strike." The revelation left Marcus with a choice: cancel the summit to protect the delegates or move forward and risk playing into the benefactors' hands. Callan urged caution, but Marcus's instincts told him retreating now would only embolden their enemies. "Postpone the summit, Marcus," Callan pleaded. "We can't ensure everyone's safety with this level of infiltration." "If we postpone, the benefactors win," Marcus said firmly. "Their goal is to destabilize us, to sow mistrust and division. If we pull back now, we hand them exactly what they want." Sael watched him intently, her gaze unreadable. "Then you'll need a strategy," she said. "One that doesn't just defend, but strikes back." Marcus turned to her. "You've faced them before, haven't you?" Sael hesitated, her expression briefly betraying a flicker of vulnerability. "Yes," she admitted. "And they don't stop until their target is obliterated. If you want to survive this, you'll have to fight like them, without mercy." The room fell silent again, the enormity of the situation weighing on everyone. Marcus spent the next hours reviewing the data with Sale by his side. They identified patterns in Harrow's communications, pinpointing potential agents embedded within the station. Sale's knowledge of the benefactors proved invaluable. Her insights revealed how deeply their tendrils had burrowed into the station's operations. But as they worked, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Sale was holding something back. Her familiarity with the benefactors, her precise understanding of their methods, it hinted at a past she wasn't sharing. "Why do you know so much about them?" Marcus finally asked, breaking the silence. Sale didn't look up from the console. "Because I was one of them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus froze. "What?" She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "Not by choice," she said quickly. "I was taken when I was young, trained to be one of their operatives. I did things I can't erase, things I don't expect forgiveness for. But I escaped, and now I use what I know to fight them." Marcus stared at her, a mix of emotions swirling in his chest: betrayal, understanding, anger, and, unexpectedly, admiration. "And why should I trust you?" he asked. Sale met his gaze, unflinching. "Because I could have killed you a dozen times by now if I wanted to," she said bluntly. "But I didn't. I chose to help you." Her words hung in the air, unanswerable. The station's lights dimmed as the artificial night cycle began, but Marcus felt no closer to rest. The summit was hours away, and the benefactor's plans loomed like a storm on the horizon. Sael joined him on the observation deck, where the stars stretched endlessly beyond the station's curved windows. "You're worried," she said, leaning against the railing. "Wouldn't you be?" Marcus replied, his voice heavy. Sael smiled faintly. "Worry is a luxury I can't afford. Action is all that matters." Marcus studied her for a moment, her sharp profile silhouetted against the stars. "Do you ever stop being a soldier?" Sael's smile faded. "No," she said quietly. "It's all I know." For a moment the two stood in silence, the weight of their shared burden drawing them closer. But the moment was shattered by the blare of an alarm. Marcus's communicator buzzed, and Callan's voice came through, panicked. "Marcus, we have a breach in the security grid. Multiple infiltrators. They're making their move." Marcus turned to Sale, his jaw tightening. "It's starting." Sale nodded, her eyes hard with determination. "Then let's finish it." As they rushed toward the security hub, Marcus couldn't help but feel the walls closing in. The benefactors were no longer in the shadows. They were here, and the battle for the station had begun. And in the chaos, the line between ally and enemy would blur further, forcing Marcus to make sacrifices he wasn't prepared for. The air in the station was electric, charged with a tension that made every breath feel heavier. Alarms screamed in a relentless cadence, their wail echoing through the steel corridors. Marcus Voss sprinted through the chaos, Sale at his side. Their footsteps rang out like gunfire as the station's security grid struggled to keep up with the benefactor's infiltration. "Section C is compromised," Sale said, her voice sharp over the noise. "They've cut through 3 layers of defense." Marcus gritted his teeth, gripping the plasma weapon he'd retrieved from the armory. "Then we stopped them before they reached the summit chamber." He didn't add what both of them knew. If the benefactors reached the chamber, they wouldn't just destroy the summit, they'd dismantle any hope of unity in the galaxy. The corridors twisted like a maze, each turn revealing signs of battle. Scorch marks marred the walls. The bodies of fallen security personnel lay crumpled where they'd fought to the last. Marcus's stomach churned, but he pushed the emotion aside. There would be time to grieve later. Ahead, the sound of gunfire grew louder, accompanied by the low hum of energy shields. Sal raised a fist, signaling Marcus to stop. She crouched low, peering around the next corner. "2 squads," she whispered. "Heavily armed. They're guarding something." "What?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. Sale's lips pressed into a thin line. "Only one way to find out." The fight was brutal. Sale moved like a ghost, her every movement calculated and precise. She slipped through the benefactor's lines, her blade a blur of deadly efficiency. Marcus followed, his plasma weapon firing in controlled bursts. The benefactors were skilled, but they hadn't expected resistance this fierce. Within minutes, the corridor was silent again, save for the labored breathing of the victors. Sale knelt beside a fallen operative, pulling a datapad from his belt. She scanned it quickly, her eyes narrowing. "They're targeting the main reactor," she said, standing. "If they overload it, the station won't just collapse. It'll take the summit delegates and half the sector with it." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. "How much time do we have?" "Not enough," Sale replied grimly. The reactor core was a cavernous expanse of machinery and glowing energy conduits. The benefactor's operatives swarmed like ants, setting charges along key points. Marcus and Sale arrived just as the first explosions echoed through the chamber. Sale assessed the situation with a practiced eye. "You take the high ground," she said, tossing him a climbing harness. "I'll handle the charges." Marcus nodded, scaling a nearby catwalk as Sale darted into the fray. From above, Marcus had a clear view of the battle below. He picked off operatives one by one, his precision buying Sale precious seconds to disable the explosives. But their enemies were relentless, and for every one they took down, 2 more seemed to appear. The tide turned when Sale reached the central control panel. She worked furiously, her fingers flying over the keys as she overrode the detonation sequence. "Almost there!" she shouted, but her voice was drowned out by a sudden deafening roar. One of the benefactor's leaders had entered the chamber, a towering figure clad in advanced combat armor. He leveled a heavy weapon at Sale, and Marcus's heart seized. Without thinking, Marcus launched himself from the catwalk, his body slamming into the armored figure. They tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs, the weapon clattering away. The ensuing struggle was vicious. The leader's strength was almost inhuman, and Marcus felt himself being overwhelmed. But he fought with a desperation born of purpose, his hands finding the release latch on the armor's power core. With a final, brutal twist, he tore the core free. The leader's body went limp, and Marcus collapsed beside him, gasping for air. Sale finished her work just as the last of the benefactor's operatives fled. The reactor stabilized, its hum returning to a steady rhythm. "It's done," she said, pulling Marcus to his feet. "We stopped them." Marcus nodded, but the weight of their victory was tempered by the cost. The station was in ruins, and many had died to protect what remained. Hours later, the summit finally convened, the delegates gathering in a battered but secure chamber. Marcus stood at the podium, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. "The events of today have shown us the lengths to which some will go to divide us," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But they've also shown us the strength we possess when we stand together. This summit isn't just about policy or trade agreements, it's about survival, about building a future where unity triumphs over fear." The room erupted into applause, but Marcus barely heard it. His eyes found Sile standing at the edge of the chamber. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to hope. As the delegates dispersed, Marcus found Sale in the observation deck. "You're leaving," he said, the statement hanging heavy between them. Sale nodded. "I've done what I came here to do. The benefactors won't stop, and I need to keep fighting them. But you've shown me that there's still something worth protecting." Marcus felt a pang of loss, but also a deep respect. "Will I see you again?" Sale's lips curved into a faint smile. "Maybe," she said, "if the stars align." With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as silently as she had arrived. The station's lights dimmed, the artificial night cycle beginning anew. Marcus stood alone, staring out at the endless expanse of stars. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. Yet for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The light in the abyss had not gone out. It burned brighter than ever.